Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways. And this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear. We should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself, that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament. And at each stage, the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance. And this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate. Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable. And these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike. And suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society. But the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others. But it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others. So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organize against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. And this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility. And these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes: unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains, uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance, for all its virtues, is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it. And the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The 5 phenomenon: why motion is an illusion your brain creates. 2 lights flash in sequence. First, one light turns on and off. Then a moment later, another light nearby turns on and off. And yet what you perceive is not 2 separate flashes, but a single light moving from the first position to the second. Continuous motion where there is none. Smooth travel through space that never occurred. And this is the 5 phenomenon, discovered by Max Wertheimer in 1912. A fundamental illusion that reveals how the brain constructs the perception of motion, shows that motion is not simply detected from sensory input, but is created, is synthesized by the visual system from discrete static images. And the 5 phenomenon is the principle behind movies and television, where still frames flashed rapidly create the illusion of continuous motion, where characters seem to move smoothly when they are really just a sequence of frozen images. An understanding fee reveals that all motion perception involves construction, involves the brain interpreting changes and inferring movement. And motion is not a basic sensory property, but is a higher level interpretation, a perceptual inference that usually corresponds to reality, but can be fooled, can be triggered by appropriate sequences, even when nothing actually moves. And the 5 phenomenon stands as evidence that perception is actively constructed rather than passively recorded, that what we see is not simply what is there, but is what the brain interprets as being there. Imagine the experimental setup: 2 dots on a screen, separated by some distance, and the first dot appears briefly, vanishes, then after a short delay, the second dot appears, and if the timing and spacing are right, you do not see 2 sequential flashes, but see 1 dot moving from the first position to the second, sliding smoothly across the space between them. And this apparent motion, this phi, is so compelling that it feels exactly like real motion, indistinguishable phenomenologically from watching an object actually travel through space. And yet nothing moved, no object traversed the gap. There were only 2 separate stationary flashes, and the motion exists only in your perception, is constructed by your brain from the temporal sequence. The 5 phenomenon reveals that the visual system assumes continuity, assumes that when similar stimuli appear in nearby locations in rapid succession, they are probably the same object in motion. And this assumption is usually correct, is how motion in the real world works. Objects move continuously from place to place, and perceiving them as moving requires detecting this spatio-temporal pattern, and the visual system has evolved to detect this pattern efficiently, to infer motion from sequences of static retinal images, and phi exploits this mechanism, presents the pattern without the actual motion, and the brain responds as it normally does, constructs motion perception, and the illusion demonstrates that motion is not directly given in sensation, but is computed from changes in position over time. Visualize motion perception as involving motion detectors, neurons that respond to changes in position, to objects moving across the visual field, and these detectors can be activated by real motion or by appropriate sequences of static stimuli. And Phi activates these detectors, creates the neural signature of motion without actual motion. And the brain cannot distinguish between motion signals caused by real movement and motion signals caused by Phi sequences. And so Phi creates genuine motion perception, creates the subjective experience of seeing something move. And this shows that motion perception is a neural state that can be produced by different causes, by real motion or by well-timed sequences. And the experience is the same, regardless of cause. The Phi phenomenon differs from other apparent motion phenomena, differs from beta motion, which is pure displacement without phenomenal movement, differs from stroboscopic motion, which is the specific type of motion seen in films, and Phi is the perception of smooth, continuous movement, is the most compelling type of apparent motion. Most closely resembles real motion, and understanding the distinctions between different types of apparent motion reveals the complexity of the motion perception system, reveals that there are multiple mechanisms, multiple ways the brain computes motion, and Phi is one specific mechanism, the mechanism that creates smooth motion perception from discrete temporal sequences. Gestalt psychologists like Wertheimer used Phi to argue against elementalist theories of perception, against theories that said perception is built up from simple sensations combined according to associations, and Phi shows that perception is not a sum of elements, not a combination of two flashes, but is a holistic interpretation, is motion that emerges from the relationship between flashes, and the whole is different from the sum of parts. And this Gestalt insight-shaped psychology influenced how perception came to be understood as involving organization and interpretation rather than simple sensation. And Phi became a canonical example, a demonstration that perception is constructive, is synthetic, creates experiences that go beyond the sensory input. The Phi phenomenon also has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you experience in Phi is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion, and yet no motion occurred in the stimulus. And this raises questions about the relationship between experience and reality, about whether experiences are always caused by corresponding physical events. And Phi shows they are not, shows that the same experience can be caused by different physical processes, by real motion, or by sequential flashes. And this supports functionalist theories of consciousness, supports the view that conscious experiences are not tied to specific physical substrates, but are computational states that can be realized in multiple ways. One implication of Phi for film and animation is that smooth motion can be created with relatively low frame rates. As long as frames are spaced appropriately in time and space, the Phi phenomenon will create smooth motion perception. And this is why movies work at 24 frames per second, why television works at similar rates. The temporal gaps between frames are short enough that Phi fills them in, creates continuous motion, and filmmakers exploit Phi to create realistic movement, to make still images come alive. And understanding Phi has been crucial to developing motion picture technology, to optimizing frame rates and timing. Another implication concerns perceptual boundaries, concerns what counts as seeing motion versus what counts as inferring motion, because Phi feels like seeing motion, feels like direct perception, not like making an inference or having a belief. And yet Phi is constructed, is synthesized by the brain from discrete inputs, and this raises questions about where perception ends and cognition begins, whether the boundary is sharp or gradual, whether there are clear distinctions between seeing and thinking, or whether perception shades continuously into cognition, and phi sits on this boundary, is simultaneously perceptual, immediate, and phenomenologically direct and cognitive, involving complex processing and interpretation. The lights flash in sequence and motion appears, smooth travel from first to second, and nothing moved, only the brain moved from sensing to interpreting, from input to output. And phi emerges, motion created from stillness, continuity created from discontinuity, and the phenomenon reveals the constructive nature of perception, reveals that experience is not a mirror of reality, but is a model constructed by the brain, a model that usually tracks reality accurately, but can be manipulated, can be triggered by artificial sequences, and the phi phenomenon endures as one of the foundational discoveries in perceptual psychology, a demonstration that motion is not given but is made, is not detected but is computed, and every motion you see, real or apparent, involves this same computation, this same construction, and phi makes the construction explicit, shows that what seems most immediate, most directly perceived, is actually mediated, is processed, is inferred, and motion is an illusion, a useful, accurate illusion usually, but an illusion nonetheless. And phi reveals this and the lights flash on. The predestination paradox. Time folds back on itself in strange ways, and among the strangest is the predestination paradox, a loop where an event in the past is caused by an event in the future, which is in turn caused by the past event, creating a circle of causation with no clear beginning. And yet, unlike other time travel paradoxes, this one involves no contradiction, only an unsettling sense that something is wrong with the very fabric of cause and effect. Imagine a historian who discovers an ancient artifact in a museum, a device whose origins are mysterious and unknown, and the historian becomes obsessed with understanding where it came from. And after years of research, they finally build a time machine and travel back to the era when the artifact should have been created. But upon arriving, they find no trace of it. No one has ever seen or heard of such a device. And in frustration, the historian accidentally leaves their own artifact behind in the past, where it is eventually discovered and placed in a museum, the very museum where the historian first found it centuries later. The artifact has no origin. It was never created. It simply exists in a loop, passed from future to past and back again, and the timeline is perfectly consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no contradiction, no paradox in the classical sense, and yet the mind recoils because it seems that something must have created the artifact, that objects do not simply exist without being made. The predestination paradox is closely related to the bootstrap paradox, but it emphasizes a different aspect of the problem. The idea that events can be predetermined by time travel, that the past is fixed not because of physical laws, but because travelers from the future have already shaped it, and any attempt to change history is doomed to fail because the changes have already happened. They are already part of the timeline. Consider a time traveler who learns of a great disaster and travels back to prevent it, but every action they take to stop the disaster instead contributes to causing it. Their warnings are misunderstood, their interventions backfire, and in the end, the disaster occurs exactly as history recorded, because the time traveler was always part of that history. Their presence was always woven into the events, and there was never any other possible outcome. This raises profound questions about free will and determinism, because if time travel is possible, and the timeline is self-consistent, then perhaps the future is already written, every choice already made, every action already determined, and the feeling of free will is an illusion, a sensation that accompanies actions that were always going to happen, that could never have happened any other way. Some physicists embrace this view, arguing that the universe is a block where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and that time travel simply reveals what was always true, that history is immutable, that the timeline is a fixed structure, and we are merely moving through it, experiencing events in sequence, but unable to alter them. Others find this vision disturbing, a denial of agency, a suggestion that nothing we do matters because it has all already been decided, and they seek alternatives. Perhaps in the many worlds interpretation, where every time travel event creates a new branch, or in models where time is more fluid and the past can genuinely be changed, though such models often struggle to avoid contradictions. The predestination paradox also appears in ancient mythology and philosophy, in the story of Oedipus, who tries to escape a prophecy but instead fulfills it through his very attempts to avoid it, in the idea of fate and destiny that pervades many cultures, the sense that some events are meant to be, that the future shapes the past as much as the past shapes the future. The paradox lingers as a reminder that time is stranger than it appears, that causation may not be as simple as earlier leading to later, that loops and circles might be woven into the structure of reality, and that the question of whether the future is open or closed, whether we are free or determined, may be inseparable from the question of whether time travel is possible, and if so, what kind of time travel the universe permits. The paradox of value, why what we need most costs least. An economist contemplates the nature of value, asks what makes things valuable, what determines worth, and observes a fundamental puzzle that prices seem disconnected from importance, that markets assign high prices to luxuries and low prices to necessities, that goods essential for human flourishing cost little while goods that serve vanity or status cost fortunes. And this is the paradox of value, the broader version of the diamond water paradox, the puzzle that spans across all goods and services. And the paradox asks why healthcare is expensive, while entertainment is cheap in some places and the reverse in others, why teachers are paid less than entertainers, why life-saving drugs are affordable in some markets and unaffordable in others, why the allocation of value by markets seems misaligned with human needs, with moral worth, with social importance. And this paradox has troubled economic thinking since ancient times, has been discussed by philosophers from Aristotle to Marx, and while modern economics offers explanations through supply and demand, through marginal utility, through market equilibrium, the paradox retains moral force, retains the sense that something is wrong, that prices should reflect importance, that markets fail to value correctly, and the paradox of value remains a central challenge for defending market allocation, for justifying price mechanisms, for explaining why efficient markets can produce what seem like perverse valuations. Imagine comparing different goods by their importance to human welfare. And air is essential, sustains life, is necessary for survival, cannot be done without for more than minutes. And yet air is free, has zero price, costs nothing. While gold is non-essential, serves no biological function, is desired only for decoration or a store of value, and yet gold is expensive, costs thousands per ounce, and this comparison illustrates the paradox, shows that necessity and price are inversely related, that the most needed goods are often cheapest and the least needed goods often expensive. And this pattern extends across many goods. Water is cheap, housing varies but is often expensive, healthcare is expensive in many places, education costs are rising, food prices are moderate, while luxuries like jewellery, sports cars, yachts, artwork, all command premium prices. And the pattern suggests that markets value incorrectly, value luxury over necessity, value status over survival. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that market allocation is unjust, is misaligned with human values. The paradox of value demonstrates the tension between exchange value, what markets assign, and use value, what humans need. And Marx emphasized this distinction, argued that capitalism systematically undervalues use value, undervalues goods necessary for life, while overvaluing exchange value, overvaluing goods that serve accumulation. And this misalignment is not accidental, but is structural, is inherent in market systems that allocate based on willingness to pay rather than on need. And those with money can bid up prices of luxuries, while those without cannot bid up prices of necessities. And markets respond to money, not to need. And this explains the paradox. It explains why diamonds are expensive and water cheap. Because those who want diamonds have money to pay high prices, while those who need water cannot afford high prices. And markets clear at prices that balance supply and demand among those with purchasing power, not among all humans with needs. Visualize the paradox as revealing different concepts of value: economic value, defined by market prices determined by supply and demand, and purchasing power, and moral or social value, defined by importance to human welfare, determined by needs and flourishing. And these two concepts diverge, are not aligned. And economic value is amoral, is neutral about what should be valued, reflects only what is valued by those with money to spend, while moral value judges that some goods are more important than others, that necessities matter more than luxuries, that human needs should be prioritized. And the paradox is the gap between these concepts, is the recognition that markets do not track moral value, do not allocate according to importance. And this gap creates the sense that markets are unjust, are inadequate for distributing goods that matter most. One response to the paradox of value is that markets are efficient, are good at allocating resources to maximize satisfaction of preferences weighted by willingness to pay. And while this may not align with moral importance, it is the best available system, is better than alternatives, like central planning, which face information problems and incentive problems. And markets at least respond to decentralized information about preferences, at least allow individuals to make choices. And efficiency does not require tracking moral importance, requires only that resources go to those who value them most as measured by willingness to pay. And this response accepts the paradox, accepts that markets do not and should not track moral value, argues that moral allocation should be achieved through other means, through taxation and redistribution, through public provision of essential goods, through regulation that ensures access to necessities, and markets should be left to allocate efficiently while other institutions address moral concerns. Another response questions whether the paradox is real, argues that necessities actually are valuable, are provided at low cost because markets are efficient at producing them, because competition drives prices down, and the reason necessities are cheap is that we have solved the production problem, have made them abundant, and abundance is good, is the goal. And the paradox mistakes low price for low value, confuses market price with social importance. And in fact, low prices for necessities mean high consumer surplus, mean people benefit greatly from access to cheap necessities. And this is success, not failure. Is markets working well? Not markets failing. And the paradox dissolves once we recognize that low prices for necessities reflect abundance and efficiency rather than lack of value, and high prices for luxuries reflect scarcity and inefficiency rather than high value. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that markets misallocate, argues that essential goods should not be left to markets, should be provided through public systems, through universal health care, through public education, through subsidized housing, and markets can allocate luxuries, can determine who gets diamonds and yachts. But necessities are different, require different allocation mechanisms, require ensuring universal access regardless of ability to pay. And this social democratic response uses the paradox to argue for limits on markets, for sectors where market allocation is inappropriate, where public provision is necessary, and the paradox becomes an argument for mixed economies, for market allocation in some domains and public allocation in others. The paradox also appears in labour markets, where compensation seems misaligned with social importance, and teachers are paid less than entertainers, nurses less than financiers, social workers less than lawyers, And this pattern suggests that markets undervalue socially important work, undervalue contributions to welfare and education and care, while overvaluing contributions to entertainment and finance. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that labour markets are unjust. And explaining the pattern requires understanding supply and demand for labour, requires recognising that compensation reflects scarcity and productivity as measured by market value, not social importance. And teachers are abundant relative to demand, while CEOs are scarce. And market productivity of CEOs as measured by profit contribution exceeds that of teachers. And these factors determine compensation, not social importance. And this explains the pattern but does not eliminate the moral concern, does not resolve the sense that something is wrong with a system that pays entertainers more than educators. Some argue that the paradox of value reveals limits of price as measure of value, reveals that not everything important can be priced, that some goods resist commodification, that markets are appropriate for some goods and inappropriate for others, and market prices are useful for allocating produced commodities but are inadequate for allocating access to health, education, safety, justice, and these latter goods require different allocation mechanisms, require treating them as rights or entitlements rather than as commodities to be purchased. And the paradox supports this view, supports the idea that markets have limits, that not everything should be for sale, that some forms of value resist market logic. The necessities remain cheap, the luxuries remain expensive, and the paradox persists. Prices diverge from importance, exchange value diverges from use value, markets allocate without regard to need, and the pattern continues, and the paradox of value endures as a permanent feature of market systems, endures as a moral challenge to market allocation, and resolving the tension requires either accepting that markets are amoral, are efficient but not just, and supplementing markets with institutions that ensure access to necessities, or rejecting markets for essential goods, replacing market allocation with public provision. And the paradox remains unresolved and troubling, showing that what we need most costs least, that prices do not track importance, that markets value incorrectly from a moral perspective, even if correctly from an economic perspective, and the paradox endures. The philosophical zombie argument, why consciousness might not come from physics. A creature walks among us that looks exactly like a human being, molecule for molecule identical, atom for atom the same, every neuron firing in the same patterns, every behavior perfectly matched. And this creature speaks as we speak, acts as we act, responds to pain by withdrawing, to beauty by smiling, to loss by crying, and yet inside there is nothing. No subjective experience, no consciousness, no inner light, no feeling of what it is like to be this creature, and this being is called a philosophical zombie, or P-zombie, a thought experiment in philosophy of mind that challenges physicalism, challenges the view that consciousness is nothing more than physical processes, and the zombie argument asks us to imagine such creatures, to consider whether they are conceivable, and if they are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible, and if they are possible, then consciousness cannot be identical to physical processes, cannot be reduced to brain states, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And this shows that consciousness is something extra, something additional to the physical. And this is the philosophical zombie argument, deployed by David Chalmers and others to defend property dualism, to argue that subjective experience is not reducible to objective physical facts. And the argument remains one of the most debated arguments in contemporary philosophy of mind. Imagine encountering a zombie, engaging in conversation, watching it navigate the world, and nothing in its behaviour betrays the absence of consciousness. It claims to be conscious, describes its experiences in first-person terms, acts exactly as a conscious being would act, and the only difference, the only divergence between zombie and human, is the inner life, the presence or absence of subjective experience, and the zombie has none, is dark inside, operates purely through physical mechanisms without any accompanying phenomenology. And the argument asks whether such a being is conceivable, whether we can coherently imagine it, and if we can, then consciousness is not necessitated by physical structure, is not entailed by brain processes, and physicalism fails, and some form of dualism must be true. The argument can be stated formally as follows: it is conceivable that there be zombies, creatures physically identical to humans, but lacking consciousness. If zombies are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not identical to physical processes. Therefore, consciousness is not identical to physical processes. And this conclusion challenges materialism, challenges the view that everything is physical, that mental states are brain states, and forces recognition of an explanatory gap, a gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts that cannot be bridged by physical explanation alone. Visualize two worlds. One is our world, filled with conscious beings who have inner lives, who experience redness and pain and joy, and the other is zombie world, physically identical. Every particle in the same position, every force acting identically, but lacking consciousness. All beings are zombies, and the question is whether zombie world is possible, whether it is a coherent scenario. And Chalmers argues that it is, that we can conceive of such a world without contradiction, and this conceivability establishes possibility, and possibility refutes physicalism, shows that physical facts do not exhaust all facts, that there are phenomenal facts that are additional to physical facts. Physicalists respond to the zombie argument in multiple ways. The most direct response denies that zombies are conceivable, argues that the apparent conceivability is illusory, that we think we can imagine zombies because we are not thinking carefully enough, not considering all the implications, and that when we try to fill in the details, try to specify exactly how a zombie would work, contradictions emerge, and zombies turn out to be impossible after all. And this response requires showing that consciousness is entailed by physical structure, that given the right physical organization, consciousness must arise. And this is the hard part, explaining why and how physical processes necessitate consciousness. Another response accepts that zombies are conceivable, but denies that conceivability implies possibility, argues that there is a gap between what we can imagine and what is actually possible, that conceivability is an epistemic notion about what seems possible to us, while possibility is a metaphysical notion about what could actually be. And these can come apart. We can conceive of things that are actually impossible, like water being something other than H2O. And Kripke's work on necessity and identity supports this, shows that identities, like water is H2O, are necessary, even though we can conceive of their negation. And the same applies to consciousness, is brain process. It might be necessarily true, even though we can conceive of its negation. And so zombies, while conceivable, are not possible, and the zombie argument fails. A third response argues that the zombie argument begs the question, assumes what it sets out to prove, because the claim that zombies are conceivable assumes that consciousness is something separable from physical processes, something that could be absent while physical processes remain. And this assumption is precisely what physicalists deny. And so the argument does not refute physicalism, but merely asserts an alternative view. And physicalists are not obliged to accept the zombie scenario as genuinely conceivable, can reject it as incoherent or question-begging. The zombie argument connects to other arguments about consciousness, to the knowledge argument about Mary, and to the explanatory gap, and to the hard problem of consciousness, all pointing to the difficulty of explaining subjective experience in physical terms, all suggesting that phenomenal consciousness resists reduction. And these arguments collectively create a case for dualism, for the view that consciousness is not physical, though the case remains controversial, remains rejected by many philosophers who maintain that consciousness will eventually be explained physically, that the apparent gap is due to ignorance, not to genuine irreducibility. The zombie walks through the world, behaving normally, seeming conscious, and yet the question hangs: is there anyone home? Is there subjective experience? Or is the creature an automaton, a sophisticated mechanism that mimics consciousness without having it? And the zombie argument uses this thought experiment to probe the nature of consciousness, to test whether consciousness can be separated from physical structure. And the answer determines whether physicalism is true, whether everything about consciousness can be explained in physical terms, or whether consciousness is something more, something that transcends the physical. And the zombie remains, conceivable or not, possible or not, a thought experiment that continues to challenge materialist theories of mind, continues to force physicalists to explain how consciousness arises from matter, how subjective experience emerges from objective processes, and the philosophical zombie endures as one of the most vivid and controversial thought experiments in philosophy. A creature that may be impossible, but whose mere conceivability threatens physicalism, whose imagined existence reveals the explanatory gap between brain and mind, between matter and consciousness, and whether zombies could exist remains disputed, remains a test case for theories of consciousness, and the zombie argument persists as a central challenge to the view that science can explain everything, that physical facts exhaust all facts, and that consciousness is nothing more than brain processes arranged in certain ways. The Preface Paradox. An author completes a lengthy scholarly work, a book synthesizing years of research, containing hundreds of individual claims about history, science, or philosophy, and the author has carefully checked each claim, believes each one to be true, based on the available evidence, and yet in the preface, the author writes something like this: "Despite my best efforts, I am certain that this book contains errors, that some of the claims I have made are false, and I apologize in advance for any mistakes that careful readers may discover." This acknowledgement is standard, even expected in academic writing, a gesture of intellectual humility, an admission that no human work is perfect. That error is inevitable in any sufficiently complex undertaking, and yet this creates a paradox, because the author believes each individual claim in the book believes that claim 1 is true, that claim 2 is true, that claim 3 is true, and so on for all the claims, and belief is usually thought to be closed under conjunction, meaning that if you believe each of several propositions, then you should believe their conjunction. And so the author should believe that all the claims in the book are true, and yet the author also believes that at least one of the claims is false, that not all of them are true, and these two beliefs are contradictory. And so the author holds contradictory beliefs, and this seems irrational. Yet the author's behaviour seems entirely reasonable. Both the individual beliefs and the belief that some of them are false seem justified. And so the preface paradox reveals a tension between rationality and consistency, between what it is reasonable to believe and what logic says about the relationships between beliefs. The paradox was first articulated clearly by David Mackinson in 1965, though related issues had been discussed earlier, and it challenges the principle that rational belief is closed under conjunction, that if you rationally believe P and rationally believe Q, then you must rationally believe P and Q, because in the preface case, the author rationally believes each claim individually, but rationally believes that their conjunction is false, or at least that the conjunction is likely to contain errors. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that it is possible to rationally believe many individual propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the number of propositions is large and the probability that each is true, while high, is less than certainty. Because if each claim has a 99% chance of being true, then a book with 100 claims has only about 37% chance of having all its claims be true, and so it is perfectly rational to believe each claim while doubting that all are true. Another response is to distinguish between degrees of belief, arguing that the author assigns high credence to each individual claim, perhaps 99%, but assigns lower credence to the conjunction of all the claims, and that there is no contradiction here, only a recognition that confidence decreases as the number of independent claims increases. And this response draws on probabilistic or Bayesian approaches to rational belief, where belief comes in degrees rather than being all or nothing, and where the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts, if they are independent, and so the probability that all claims are true can be much lower than the probability that any particular claim is true. A third response is to argue that the author's belief in the preface, the belief that the book contains errors, is of a different kind than the beliefs in the individual claims, that it is a higher order belief about the author's own fallibility rather than a first-order belief about the subject matter of the book, and that there is no direct contradiction between believing that you are generally fallible and believing specific claims, just as there is no contradiction in a weather forecaster believing that their forecasts are occasionally wrong while believing that today's forecast is correct. The preface paradox connects to broader issues in epistemology about the nature of rational belief, the role of evidence, the significance of consistency, and whether it is possible for a rational agent to knowingly hold inconsistent beliefs. And while inconsistency is generally considered a mark of irrationality, the preface paradox suggests that there are cases where inconsistency, or at least apparent inconsistency, is unavoidable and perhaps even required by rationality, because to refuse to acknowledge the possibility of error when error is statistically almost certain would itself be a form of irrationality, a failure to properly calibrate beliefs to the evidence. The paradox also relates to the lottery paradox, another puzzle about rational belief and probability, where you rationally believe of each ticket in a large fair lottery that it will not win, but you also rationally believe that some ticket will win, and again rational belief seems to violate closure under conjunction. And together these paradoxes suggest that the classical logical picture of belief, where beliefs are consistent sets of propositions closed under logical consequence, may not accurately capture how rational agents actually form and maintain beliefs in conditions of uncertainty. The preface paradox has practical implications for how we think about knowledge and expertise, because it suggests that experts, even while justifiably confident in their individual judgments, should maintain an overall humility about the possibility of error. And this humility is not a sign of weakness or uncertainty, but a recognition of the statistical reality of human fallibility. And it supports practices like peer review, replication, and open debate, all of which are mechanisms for catching errors that individual researchers, despite their care and expertise, are likely to make. The paradox also raises questions about the ethics of assertion and testimony, about what it is permissible to assert or to claim as knowledge, because if the author knows that the book contains errors, in the sense of being confident that at least one claim is false, then is it honest to present the book as if all the claims are true, or should every claim be hedged with qualifications and caveats? And if so, would this not make communication impossibly cumbersome? And yet, if we present claims without hedges, do we mislead our audience? Do we pretend to a certainty we do not possess? And these questions have no easy answers, and different contexts may call for different standards of assertion, with scientific writing allowing for the acknowledgement of fallibility in a way that courtroom testimony or medical diagnosis may not. The author sits with the completed manuscript, proud of the work yet aware of its limitations, believing each sentence yet doubting the whole, and this dual attitude, far from being irrational, seems to be the mark of a careful and honest thinker, someone who takes seriously both the evidence for individual claims and the statistical likelihood of error. And the preface paradox forces recognition that rationality is more complex than simple consistency, that the principles governing rational belief must accommodate uncertainty, fallibility, and the limits of human cognition, and that sometimes the rational response to evidence is to hold beliefs that are, in a technical sense, inconsistent. And this inconsistency is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature of how finite minds navigate an uncertain world. And the paradox remains, a puzzle that challenges our theories of rational belief, that resists easy resolution, and that reminds us that even the attempt to be perfectly rational, perfectly consistent, perfectly certain, is itself a kind of error, a failure to recognize that error is inevitable, that certainty is elusive, and that the best we can do is to believe what the evidence supports, while acknowledging that some of what we believe must, almost certainly, be false. The problem of other minds, how you know anyone else, is conscious. You observe a person crying, tears streaming down their face, and you infer that they are sad, that they are experiencing the subjective feeling of sadness, the inner emotional state. And this inference seems natural, seems obvious, but philosopher Bertrand Russell asks what justifies it. What evidence proves that other people have minds, have consciousness, have inner experiences like yours? And the evidence is purely behavioural. You see the tears, hear the words, observe the actions, but you never directly experience another person's consciousness, never feel their pain or see their thoughts. And so the inference from behaviour to consciousness is not logically certain, cannot be proven beyond doubt. And it is logically possible, conceivably, though perhaps not believably, that other people are unconscious automata, zombies who behave as if conscious but have no inner life. And this possibility, however remote, reveals that our knowledge of other minds is inferential, is based on analogy to our own case. And this is the problem of other minds. The epistemological challenge of justifying our belief that other people are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, that they are not merely sophisticated mechanisms producing behaviour without accompanying phenomenology. Imagine trying to prove that someone else has consciousness, trying to establish with certainty that they have subjective experiences, and you observe their behaviour, see them wince in pain, hear them describe their feelings, watch them respond appropriately to stimuli, and all this behaviour is consistent with consciousness, is what we expect conscious beings to do, but it is also consistent with unconsciousness, with sophisticated programming that produces appropriate responses without any inner experience, and there is no test, no observation, no experiment that directly reveals consciousness, that proves beyond doubt that someone else has subjective experiences, and so the inference to other minds is always uncertain, is always vulnerable to skeptical doubt. And while we do not actually doubt that other people are conscious, while the skeptical scenario seems absurd, the philosophical point is that our belief cannot be proven, cannot be established with the certainty we might desire. The problem of other minds rests on the asymmetry between first-person and third-person access to mental states. You have direct access to your own consciousness, immediate awareness of your own thoughts and feelings, but you have only indirect access to others' consciousness, can only infer it from their behaviour and their reports. And this asymmetry creates an epistemological gap, a gap between what you can know with certainty about yourself and what you can know about others, and crossing this gap requires inference, requires reasoning from observed behaviour to unobserved mental states. And such inference is never certain, always vulnerable to error. The traditional solution to the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy, which says that I observe a correlation in my own case between mental states and behaviour. I know that when I am in pain, I exhibit certain behaviours. When I am sad, I cry, and so on. And I observe that other humans exhibit the same behaviours. And by analogy, I infer that they have the same mental states, that when they exhibit pain behaviour, they are in pain. And this analogy is strengthened by the similarity between my body and their bodies, by the fact that we share similar physiology, and so it is reasonable to infer that we share similar mental lives. but critics of the argument from analogy point out that it is based on a sample size of one. On my own case, and generalizing from one case to all cases is weak induction. And moreover, the analogy assumes what it sets out to prove, assumes that behavioral similarity indicates mental similarity, and this assumption is precisely what the skeptic challenges. Visualize the epistemic situation. You are confined to your own consciousness, your own first-person perspective, and everyone else exists outside this perspective, exists as objects in your experience rather than as subjects with their own experiences. And the question is how you know that these objects are also subjects, also have inner lives, and the answer cannot be certain, cannot be proven, can only be inferred with greater or lesser confidence. And this realization that our knowledge of other minds is uncertain is one of the permanent features of the human epistemic situation, a gap that cannot be fully closed. Another approach to the problem of other minds appeals to the best explanation, argues that the hypothesis that other people are conscious, that they have minds, is the best explanation of their behavior, that positing consciousness explains why people speak as they do, why they report experiences, why they act purposefully, and so on. And while the zombie hypothesis, the hypothesis that people lack consciousness, is logically possible, it is not plausible, not the best explanation, and so we are justified in believing that other people are conscious, even though we cannot prove it with certainty. And this response treats knowledge of other minds as a theoretical inference, as a hypothesis confirmed by evidence, rather than a conclusion proven with certainty. A third approach, associated with Wittgenstein, questions the framework of the problem, argues that the idea of privately checking whether another person is conscious is confused, that consciousness is not a hidden inner property that might be present or absent while behavior remains the same, but is manifested in behavior, is constituted by appropriate responsiveness, and there is no gap between behavior and mind, no possibility of zombie-like creatures that behave as if conscious but lack consciousness, because consciousness just is the pattern of appropriate behavior, and the problem of other minds dissolves, because it is based on a misunderstanding of what consciousness is, treats it as an inner object rather than as a pattern of life. The problem of other minds connects to debates about artificial intelligence, about whether machines could be conscious, because the same epistemic situation applies. We observe the behavior of AI systems, see them generate text, respond to questions, exhibit apparently intelligent behavior, and the question arises whether there is consciousness behind the behavior, whether the machine has subjective experiences, or whether it is merely processing symbols without understanding. And our inability to solve the problem of other minds for humans makes the question of machine consciousness even more difficult, even more uncertain, and we face the possibility that we may never know whether AI is conscious, may never be able to prove or disprove machine sentience. The problem also has practical implications for how we treat non-human animals, for whether they have consciousness, feel pain, deserve moral consideration, and our evidence is behavioral. We see animals exhibit pain behavior, avoid harm, seek pleasure, and we infer that they are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, but the inference is uncertain. Is more uncertain the more different the animal is from us, and the problem of other minds makes it difficult to establish definitively which animals are conscious, which can suffer, which deserve protection. You see the person crying, and you believe they are sad, and you comfort them, and the interaction proceeds as if their consciousness is real, as if their suffering matters. And practically, this is enough. Socially, this is how we function. But philosophically, the question remains, how do you know? How can you prove that they are not a sophisticated zombie, that there is really someone home behind the tears? And the answer is that you cannot prove it, can only infer it, can only trust in analogy and explanation, and the shared form of life that suggests consciousness is universal among humans. And the problem of other minds persists, not as a practical obstacle but as a philosophical recognition of the limits of knowledge, the gap between self and other, between first-person certainty and third-person inference, and the problem endures as a permanent feature of epistemology, a reminder that some things cannot be known with certainty, that consciousness is private, that the inner life of another remains always partially hidden, always known only through the indirect evidence of behaviour and report. And the crying continues, and the inference to sadness continues, and life proceeds, and the problem remains, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a gap that defines the epistemic situation of embodied minds, trying to know other embodied minds, and the question persists, how do you know anyone else is conscious? And the honest answer is, you do not know with certainty. You only believe with confidence but without proof. And this uncertainty is part of what it means to be human, to be a conscious being among what you believe are other conscious beings, but can never know for certain. The problem of the many. A cloud drifts across the sky, its edges soft and undefined, fading gradually into the surrounding air, and a question arises that seems absurd at first. How many clouds are there? Is it one cloud, or is it many? And the answer is not as obvious as it seems, because the boundary of a cloud is vague, imprecise, and this vagueness creates a puzzle known as the problem of the many, a paradox about identity and indeterminacy that challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a single object. Consider the cloud more carefully. There is no sharp line where the cloud ends and the clear air begins. Instead, there is a gradient of water droplet density, thicker in some regions and thinner in others. And so we could draw the boundary of the cloud in many slightly different ways, each including or excluding a few droplets at the edges. And each such boundary defines a distinct aggregate of water molecules, and each aggregate has an equal claim to being the cloud. None is more privileged than any other, and so instead of one cloud there are millions of overlapping cloud candidates, each differing by just a few molecules, and all of them present at the same time in the same region of space. The problem generalizes to nearly every ordinary object. A cat sitting on a mat consists of trillions of cells and molecules, and the boundary of the cat is not precise. A few skin cells flake off constantly, a few hairs are loose, and so there are countless cat candidates, each differing slightly in which particles they include, and all of them have an equal claim to being the cat. And yet we do not say there are millions of cats sitting on the mat. We say there is one cat, and this creates a tension between our linguistic and conceptual practices and the metaphysical reality that seems to support vast multiplicity where we perceive unity. The paradox was articulated clearly by Peter Unger in the 1980s, though the underlying issue has roots in ancient philosophy, and it forces a choice between several unappealing options. One option is to accept that there really are many overlapping objects where we ordinarily think there is one. Millions of clouds and cats and tables all occupying nearly the same space, differing only by a few particles at the margins. Another option is to deny that ordinary objects exist at all, arguing that only fundamental particles or fields are real, and that clouds and cats are mere conventional designations we impose on complex arrangements of matter. And a third option is to embrace vagueness in the world itself, arguing that there is no fact of the matter about exactly which particles compose the cat, that the cat is a vague object with indeterminate boundaries. Though this raises difficult questions about the metaphysics of vagueness and whether reality itself can be indeterminate, or whether indeterminacy exists only in language and thought. Some philosophers argue that identity is conventional. That which aggregates counts as the cloud or the cat is determined by our practical interests and linguistic conventions rather than by objective facts. That there is no deep truth about where the cloud ends, only a question of what it is useful or natural to call a cloud in various contexts. And this view dissolves the paradox by denying that there is a genuine metaphysical problem, replacing it with a pragmatic question about how we choose to describe the world. Others insist that the problem of the many reveals a real difficulty in our ontology, that the world does not come pre-divided into discrete objects, that individuation is imposed by minds rather than discovered in nature, and that the apparent distinctness and unity of ordinary things is an artifact of perception and cognition rather than a feature of reality itself. The problem also connects to issues in vagueness and the Sauritz paradox, because if the boundaries of objects are vague, then questions like how many clouds are in the sky or how many hairs must a person lose to become bald have no determinate answers. And this suggests that much of our language is infected with indeterminacy, that most predicates do not have sharp extensions, and that the classical logical principle of bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false, may fail for a vast range of ordinary claims. The problem of the many lingers as a reminder that the world of discrete objects we navigate daily, a world of cats and clouds and people, may be a useful fiction, a conceptual overlay we impose on a reality that is far more fluid and indeterminate than it appears, and that the question of how many things there are may have no answer, or infinitely many answers, or no meaning at all depending on how we choose to carve up the continuous flux of matter and energy into countable, nameable entities. The prisoner's dilemma: why rational people choose worse outcomes. Two criminals are arrested, held in separate cells, cannot communicate, and the prosecutor offers each the same deal: testify against your partner and you go free while your partner gets 10 years, or stay silent, and if your partner also stays silent, you both get 1 year for a lesser charge. But if you stay silent and your partner testifies, then you get 10 years and your partner goes free. And if you both testify, you both get 5 years. And each prisoner must decide independently, without knowing what the other will choose. And the rational analysis is straightforward. From each prisoner's perspective, testifying dominates staying silent. If your partner stays silent, you get freedom by testifying versus 1 year by staying silent. And if your partner testifies, you get 5 years by testifying versus 10 years by staying silent. So regardless of what your partner does, you're better off testifying. And since both prisoners reason this way, both testify, both get 5 years, and yet if both had stayed silent, both would have gotten only 1 year. And so rational individual decision-making produces a collectively worse outcome. And this is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most important concepts in game theory, a demonstration that individual rationality can lead to collective irrationality, that pursuing self-interest can harm everyone, including yourself. And the dilemma has applications across economics, politics, environmental policy, international relations, and reveals fundamental tensions between individual and collective good, between rationality and cooperation. Imagine being one of the prisoners, sitting in the cell, considering your options, and you reason: if I stay silent, I get either 1 year if my partner stays silent, or 10 years if my partner testifies. And if I testify, I get either freedom if my partner stays silent, or 5 years if my partner testifies. And comparing these, testifying is better in both cases, gives me a better outcome regardless of what my partner does. And this is a dominant strategy, a strategy that is best no matter what others do. And rationality seems to require choosing your dominant strategy. And so you testify, and your partner reasons the same way, also testifies, and you both get 5 years. And looking back, you realize that if you had both stayed silent, you would both be better off, would both get only 1 year, but you had no way to ensure your partner would stay silent, no way to trust. And without trust, the rational choice is to testify, even though cooperation would benefit both. The prisoner's dilemma demonstrates the difference between Nash equilibrium, a state where no player can improve by changing strategy unilaterally, and Pareto optimality, a state where no one can be made better off without making someone worse off. And in the dilemma, both testifying as a Nash equilibrium because neither prisoner can improve by switching to silence if the other is testifying. But both testifying is not Pareto optimal because both could be better off if both stayed silent. And this divergence between equilibrium and optimality is what creates the dilemma, shows that rational individual decision-making can get stuck in suboptimal outcomes, can fail to reach mutually beneficial cooperation. Visualize the dilemma as a payoff matrix. Rows represent prisoner A's choices, columns represent prisoner B's choices, and the cells show the outcomes. And the structure reveals that mutual cooperation yields better outcomes than mutual defection. But cooperation is risky, is vulnerable to exploitation, and defection is safe. Is the rational choice if you cannot trust your partner. And the dilemma captures this tension between cooperation and defection, between trusting others and protecting yourself. And this tension is ubiquitous, appears in countless real-world situations, from arms races to environmental agreements to business competition. The prisoner's dilemma has multiple variants: iterated prisoner's dilemma, where the same players interact repeatedly. An iteration changes the analysis because future interactions create incentives for cooperation, create opportunities for reputation building and retaliation, and strategies like tit for tat, where you cooperate initially and then mirror your partner's previous choice, perform well in iterated games, achieve cooperation through reciprocity. And this shows that repeated interaction can solve the dilemma, can enable cooperation even among self-interested rational agents. And real-world interactions are often repeated, are embedded in ongoing relationships, and this repetition facilitates cooperation, makes trust possible. Another variant is the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, also called the tragedy of the commons, where many individuals face the choice between cooperating, restraining themselves for collective benefit, or defecting, pursuing individual benefit at collective cost. And examples include overfishing, pollution, climate change, where each individual's rational self-interest leads to collective disaster. And the tragedy of the commons shows that the prisoner's dilemma scales applies to large groups. And the problem is even harder with many players because coordination is more difficult, free riding is easier, and collective action problems arise, and solving these requires institutions, requires mechanisms for enforcement, for monitoring, for punishing defectors. And this is why societies have laws, have regulations, have enforcement mechanisms, because voluntary cooperation is difficult to sustain in large groups facing prisoners' dilemmas. The dilemma also has implications for moral philosophy, for understanding ethics and rationality, because the dilemma shows that rationality and morality can conflict, that the rational choice is to defect, to pursue self-interest, but the moral choice is to cooperate, to consider collective welfare. And this conflict challenges theories that equate rationality with morality, shows that purely self-interested rationality is insufficient for social welfare, requires supplementation with moral considerations, with concern for others, and various moral theories respond differently. Consequentialism might argue that the rational thing is to cooperate because outcomes matter. Contractarianism might argue that rational agents would agree to constraints on defection to avoid mutual harm. And virtue ethics might argue that cooperating reflects good character, even if not strictly rational, in narrow self-interest. One lesson from the prisoner's dilemma is the importance of institutions, of mechanisms that change incentives, that make cooperation rational, and laws that punish defection, contracts that bind parties, monitoring systems that detect cheating, all serve to solve prisoners' dilemmas. All transform situations where defection is rational into situations where cooperation is rational. And understanding the dilemma helps design better institutions, helps create systems where individual incentives align with collective good. And much of economics and political science concerns this problem, concerns how to structure institutions to promote cooperation in dilemma-like situations. Another lesson is the importance of communication, of trust building, of reputation, because in real-world dilemmas, players can communicate, can make commitments, can observe each other's behavior over time, and these factors facilitate cooperation, make it easier to coordinate on the cooperative outcome. And experiments show that allowing communication increases cooperation rates dramatically in prisoners' dilemmas. And this is why diplomacy matters, why negotiation matters, why building relationships matters, because these processes enable cooperation even when individual incentives favour defection. The prisoners sit in separate cells, cannot communicate, face the choice, and rational analysis drives them both to testify, to defect, even though cooperation would benefit both. And the dilemma reveals that rationality is not enough, that collective outcomes require more than individual optimization, require cooperation, trust, institutions, repeated interaction, communication, and the prisoner's dilemma remains one of the most important concepts in social science, a simple game that captures fundamental tensions in social life, that shows why cooperation is difficult, why self-interest can be self-defeating, why rational agents can fail to achieve optimal outcomes, and the dilemma persists as a permanent challenge to theories of rationality, to assumptions about markets and institutions, and as a tool for understanding why societies need laws, norms, enforcement, reputation, communication, all mechanisms that help solve dilemmas, that enable cooperation despite individual incentives to defect. And the prisoners testify, and both lose more than they needed to, and the dilemma endures. The potato paradox. A farmer harvests 100 kilograms of potatoes, and these potatoes are 99% water by weight, meaning that only 1 kilogram is solid potato material and 99 kilograms is water. And the farmer leaves the potatoes out in the sun to dry, and after some time the water content has decreased. The potatoes are now 98% water instead of 99%. And the question is posed, how much do the potatoes weigh now? And the intuitive answer is that they have lost a little water, perhaps 1 kilogram, and so they now weigh 99 kilograms, or perhaps 98 kilograms. But this intuition is wildly wrong. The correct answer is that the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. They have lost half their weight, and this shocking result is the potato paradox, a puzzle about percentages and proportions that reveals how badly human intuition handles these concepts. The calculation proceeds as follows. The solid potato material, the non-water part, weighs 1 kilogram both before and after drying. This does not change. The potatoes lose water, but not solid material. And before drying, this 1 kilogram of solid material represents 1% of the total weight, because the potatoes are 99% water and 1% solid, and after drying this same 1 kilogram of solid material must represent 2% of the total weight, because the potatoes are now 98% water and therefore 2% solid. And if 1 kilogram is 2% of the total weight, then the total weight must be 50 kilograms. Because 1 kilogram divided by 2% equals 50 kilograms, and so the potatoes have lost 50 kilograms of water, going from 100 kilograms to 50 kilograms, even though the percentage of water has decreased by only 1 percentage point, from 99% to 98%. The paradox reveals how deceptive percentages can be, how a small change in percentage can correspond to a large change in absolute quantity, and the confusion arises from conflating different reference points. The percentage of water is calculated relative to the total weight, which itself changes as water is lost. And so the meaning of 99% water before drying is different from the meaning of 98% water after drying, because the total weight is different. And this shifting reference point makes the percentage decrease seem small when in fact it corresponds to a massive, absolute loss of water. Another way to see the solution is to focus on the solid material. Before drying, the ratio of water to solid is 99:1, and after drying the ratio is 98:2, which simplifies to 49:1. And since the solid material remains 1 kilogram throughout, the water content must be 49 kilograms after drying, giving a total weight of 50 kilograms. And this calculation makes clear that the ratio of water to solid has nearly halved, from 99 parts water per part solid to 49 parts water per part solid. And this large change in ratio corresponds to the loss of half the total weight. The potato paradox has analogues in many real-world contexts where percentages and proportions are used. In economics, where small percentage changes in large quantities can represent enormous absolute changes. In medicine, where changes in concentrations or doses must be carefully calculated to avoid errors. In environmental science, where changes in atmospheric composition are measured in parts per million but can have large effects. And in all these contexts, the potato paradox serves as a warning that percentage changes can be misleading, that absolute quantities matter, and that careful calculation is necessary to avoid errors. The paradox also illustrates a general principle about proportions, that when the total changes, percentages relative to that total change in non-obvious ways, and that converting between percentages and absolute quantities requires attention to what the percentage is calculated relative to, and failure to track the denominator, failure to notice that the reference point is shifting, leads to systematic errors in reasoning, errors that the potato paradox exemplifies. Some people respond to the potato paradox by rejecting the premise, by arguing that potatoes cannot go from 99% water to 98% water by drying, that the numbers are unrealistic, but this response misses the point. The paradox is a thought experiment designed to illustrate mathematical relationships, and while the specific numbers may be exaggerated for effect, the underlying principle is sound, and similar calculations arise in realistic scenarios involving concentrations, dilutions, evaporations, and mixing, and understanding the potato paradox helps avoid errors in these practical contexts. The paradox is also pedagogically valuable. It is often used to teach proportional reasoning, to help students understand the difference between absolute and relative quantities, to emphasize the importance of identifying what a percentage is calculated relative to, and to show that intuition about percentages is often wrong, that careful calculation is necessary, and that problems involving changing totals require extra care, and students who master the potato paradox gain insight into a whole class of problems involving ratios, proportions, and percentages, problems that appear throughout mathematics, science, economics, and everyday life. The 100 kilograms of potatoes sit in the sun, water evaporating, and the percentage of water drops from 99 to 98, a change that sounds small, that feels negligible, and yet the weight has halved. 50 kilograms of water have disappeared, and the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. And this result shocks, violates expectation, reveals the gap between how percentages sound and what they mean, and the paradox endures, a simple problem with a surprising answer, a calculation that seems wrong but is right, a demonstration that percentages are tricky, that proportions shift in non-obvious ways, and that human intuition about these matters is unreliable, needs correction, needs training, needs the discipline of mathematics to avoid systematic error. And the paradox remains, taught in classrooms, discussed in puzzles, a permanent reminder that numbers are subtle, that context matters, that reference points shift, and that the gap between 99% and 98%, which sounds like 1%, can actually represent 50% of the total. And the potatoes shrink, the water evaporates, and the weight drops, and the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a lesson in proportional reasoning wrapped in a story about potatoes and sunshine. The ship of Theseus. A ship returns to harbour after a long voyage, its wooden planks weathered and damaged by storms and salt. and the repairs begin. One plank is removed and replaced with new wood, then another, and over months or years every single plank, every beam, every nail is replaced until nothing of the original materials remains. And yet it is still called the Ship of Theseus, still registered under the same name, still captained by the same crew, and the question arises, is it the same ship or a different ship? And if it is different, when did it become different? After the first plank was replaced, or the 10th, or the last, and where is the boundary between identity and change? The paradox is ancient, discussed by Greek and Roman philosophers, and it strikes at the heart of what it means for an object to persist through time, to remain itself despite losing and gaining parts. And the problem deepens when a second scenario is introduced. Imagine that all the original planks removed from the Ship of Theseus are collected and stored, and then using only those original materials, a second ship is built, an exact replica assembled from the very wood that once formed the Ship of Theseus. And now there are two ships, one that has been continuously repaired and one that is made entirely of the original materials. And which one is the true Ship of Theseus, the one with continuity of form and function, or the one with continuity of material? The paradox has no clear answer, and different philosophical traditions offer different responses. Some argue that identity is determined by material composition, that an object is the sum of its parts, and so the ship made from original planks is the true Ship of Theseus, even though it was disassembled and reassembled, while others argue that identity is determined by form and function, that what makes the ship is its structure and purpose, and so the continuously repaired ship retains its identity, even though none of its original material remains. Still others suggest that identity is conventional, a matter of social agreement and practical convenience, that there is no objective fact about which ship is the real Ship of Theseus, only a question of what we choose to call it based on our needs and conventions. The paradox extends beyond ships to living organisms because the cells in the human body are constantly dying and being replaced. And over a period of years, almost every atom in the body is exchanged with the environment. And yet a person is considered the same person throughout their life. And so what makes identity persist? Is it continuity of consciousness, continuity of memory, continuity of physical form, or something else entirely? The problem also appears in legal and ethical contexts, questions about personal responsibility over time, whether a person who has changed dramatically is still accountable for actions committed decades earlier, whether a corporation that has replaced all its employees and assets is still the same entity bound by old contracts, whether a nation that has undergone revolution and transformation retains the obligations of its former government. Some philosophers embrace a four-dimensionalist view, arguing that objects are not three-dimensional things that persist through time, but four-dimensional space-time worms, extended through time as well as space, and that what we call the Ship of Theseus is really a temporally extended object, a continuous path through space-time, and the question of identity becomes a question of how we slice that four-dimensional object into temporal parts. Others reject this view, insisting that objects exist wholly at each moment, that the Ship of Theseus at one time is numerically identical to the Ship of Theseus at another time, if there is the right kind of continuity between them, though what counts as the right kind of continuity remains disputed. The Ship of Theseus paradox remains unsolved, a puzzle that philosophy has examined for over 2 millennia without reaching consensus, and it stands as a reminder that identity, persistence, and change are not as straightforward as they seem, that the question of what makes something the same thing over time is one of the deepest and most difficult in metaphysics, and that the world we navigate, full of objects and people and institutions that seem to endure, may be far more fluid and ambiguous than common sense suggests. The problem of the one why nothing can be truly unified. A philosopher asks the opposite question, not why there are many where we expect one, but why there is one where we observe many, asks how parts compose wholes, how multiplicity becomes unity, how many things can constitute one thing, and this is the problem of the one, the puzzle about unity, about what makes a collection of parts into a genuine single object rather than merely a plurality. And the problem is ancient, goes back to Greek philosophy, to debates about whether wholes are real or are merely conceptual constructions from parts. And the puzzle is that unity seems to require something beyond mere collection, requires a principle of unity that binds parts together. But what could this principle be? What makes a collection of atoms a person, rather than merely atoms arranged person-wise? What makes a ship rather than merely planks fastened together? And if unity is not explained by parts alone, then what explains it? And if unity is just conceptual, just imposed by our minds, then objects are not real, are not mind-independent, and reality consists only of parts, of fundamental particles, and all composition is conventional. And this threatens ordinary ontology, threatens the reality of familiar objects. And this is the problem of the one, the challenge to explain how genuine unity arises from multiplicity, how the one emerges from the many. Imagine a statue, a bronze sculpture of a human figure, and ask what the statue is, and one answer says the statue is a collection of bronze atoms arranged statue-wise. The atoms are parts and the statue is the whole. They compose. But what makes this collection a statue rather than merely atoms? What unifies the atoms into one object? And the answer cannot be just spatial proximity, because atoms separated by empty space are still separate, not unified. And the answer cannot be just causal interaction, because atoms in different objects interact causally, through electromagnetic forces, without composing a single object. And the answer seems to require something additional, a principle of unity, a form in Aristotelian terms, or a substance in Cartesian terms, something that binds parts into wholes. But this additional element is mysterious, is not itself a physical part, and positing it seems like mysterious ontology, and avoiding it seems to require denying that wholes exist, accepting mereological nihilism, the view that only simples exist, only fundamental particles, and composition never occurs, and all talk of composite objects is loose speaking, is convenient fiction. The problem of the one connects to debates about composition, about when parts compose wholes, about what conditions must be met for composition to occur, and the problem is that every proposed answer seems either too permissive, allows too many compositions, allows arbitrary collections to count as objects, or too restrictive, disallows too many compositions, eliminates familiar objects, and finding the right balance, the correct answer to when composition occurs, has proven impossible. And Peter van Inwagen argued that this impossibility suggests composition rarely occurs, perhaps only when parts constitute living organisms, and ordinary inanimate objects do not exist, are not genuine wholes, are only simples arranged object-wise. And this revisionary ontology preserves unity for organisms, but eliminates most ordinary objects. And critics find this too extreme, too counterintuitive, too willing to deny the obvious existence of chairs and tables and planets. Visualize unity as a relation between parts that binds them into wholes. And the question is, what grounds this relation? What makes it obtain? And if the relation is fundamental, not reducible to other facts about parts, then we have expanded our ontology, have added relations to our list of basic entities. And if the relation is reducible, is just parts having certain properties, or standing in certain spatial or causal relations, then we can eliminate talk of wholes, can replace it with talk of parts and their relations. And the whole is not an additional entity, but is just the parts and relations described collectively. And this eliminativist approach solves the problem of the one, by denying that unified wholes exist, accepting that only parts exist and unity is conceptual, is our way of organizing parts into groups. And objects are not discovered but constructed by our practices of grouping and naming. One response to the problem of the one embraces mereological universalism, argues that any parts whatsoever compose a whole, that composition always occurs, that for any collection of objects, no matter how disparate, there is a further object that they compose. And this position accepts vast ontology, accepts that there are objects, like the fusion of your left hand and the Eiffel Tower, bizarre, scattered objects that common sense would reject. And the advantage is that composition is simple, unrestricted, explained by a single principle. But the disadvantage is that most composite objects are not recognized by ordinary thought, are not natural kinds, are arbitrary fusions, and this threatens to make ontology too easy, too unconstrained, accepts too much rather than too little. Another response accepts that some compositions occur and others do not, that there are principal distinctions, that organisms compose wholes but arbitrary collections do not, that bonding or causation or functional integration grounds composition determines when parts unify into wholes, and this moderate position preserves ordinary objects, accepts that chairs and organisms exist while rejecting bizarre fusions. And the challenge is to state the principle precisely, to say exactly which compositions occur, and every proposed principle faces counterexamples, faces cases where intuition says composition occurs, but the principle says it does not, or vice versa, and no principle has won consensus, and the problem of the one persists as a challenge to find the correct theory of composition. A third response questions whether the problem has a solution, argues that composition is vague, is indeterminate, that there are cases where there is no fact of the matter whether composition occurs, where the boundary between unified whole and mere collection is fuzzy. And this response treats the problem of the one as showing that reality is indeterminate in certain respects, that not all questions about existence have determinate answers, and some philosophers embrace this, accept vague existence, while others reject it as incoherent, as violating the law of excluded middle, and the debate continues. The problem of the one also affects our understanding of ourselves, of persons, because persons seem to be unified wholes, seem to be single subjects of experience, despite being composed of many cells, many organs, many subsystems. And what unifies a person? What makes a collection of cells? One person rather than many cells. And the answer cannot be just physical contiguity, because persons survive cell replacement, survive gradual change in material composition, and the answer seems to require psychological continuity, sameness of consciousness, unity of perspective. But these are not physical properties, are not features of cells, and so persons might not be physical objects, might be non-physical entities that somehow relate to bodies, and this threatens materialism, threatens the view that persons are nothing over and above their physical parts. And the problem of the one for persons remains unsolved, remains a challenge for theories of personal identity. The statue stands, one or many, unified or merely assembled, and the person exists, one subject or many cells, and the problem of the one persists, asking how unity arises, how the many become one, how parts compose wholes, and no answer fully satisfies. No theory explains unity without mystery, without positing irreducible relations or denying obvious unities, and the problem endures as a central puzzle in metaphysics, a challenge to explain what we take for granted, that objects are singular, are unified, are more than mere heaps of parts, and perhaps unity is primitive, is inexplicable, is something we must accept without analysis, or perhaps unity is illusory, is imposed by mind on parts that remain forever separate, and the problem remains, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology. The private language argument, why you cannot invent words only you understand. A person decides to create a private language, a language for describing inner sensations that only the person can experience, and the person picks a letter, say S, and decides that S will refer to a particular sensation, a specific feeling that recurs occasionally, and whenever the sensation occurs, the person writes S in a diary, and the person is the only one who knows what S means. The only one who can identify the sensation, because the sensation is private, is accessible only to the person who feels it. And this seems possible, seems like something anyone could do. Seems like we already do this to some extent when we give names to our own private experiences, but Ludwig Wittgenstein argues in his philosophical investigations that such a private language is impossible, that the scenario described involves a fundamental confusion about how language works, about what it means for a word to have meaning. And this is the private language argument, one of the most discussed and controversial arguments in 20th century philosophy, a challenge to the idea that we can give meaning to words through private mental acts of association, through inner ostensive definition, and an argument that meaning requires public criteria, requires shared practices, requires more than individual intention or inner recognition. Imagine the person using S over time, writing it when the sensation occurs, and now the question arises, how does the person know they are using S correctly? How does the person know that today's sensation is the same as yesterday's sensation, that both deserve the label S, and the person consults memory, remembers what S means, remembers the sensation, and judges that yes, the current sensation matches, deserves the label S. But Wittgenstein asks what makes this judgment correct. What distinguishes correctly remembering what S means from merely seeming to remember correctly? And in a public language, there are external checks. Other speakers can correct mistakes, can point out when a word is misused. But in a private language, there is no external check, no way to distinguish genuine correctness from apparent correctness, no way to distinguish following a rule from merely thinking one is following a rule, and so the distinction collapses. And if there is no distinction between being right and seeming right, then there is no meaning, no rule, no language, only the illusion of language. The argument can be stated as a dilemma. Either the private language user has a criterion for correct use of S, something that determines when S applies and when it does not, or the user has no criterion, and if there is a criterion, then it must be something public, something that could, in principle, be recognized by others, because private criteria are impossible, cannot distinguish correct from incorrect application, and so the language is not really private. And if there is no criterion, then S does not have a meaning, does not refer to anything determinate, is just a mark that the user writes arbitrarily. And either way, private language fails. Either it is not really private or it is not really language, and the conclusion is that language requires public criteria, requires embedding in shared practices, requires more than inner acts of association. Visualize the private language user checking whether to apply S, looking inward, consulting the memory of what S means, and judging that the current sensation matches. And Wittgenstein compares this to buying several copies of the same newspaper to check whether the first copy was telling the truth. The consultation of memory is not an independent check, not a genuine verification, because memory itself might be mistaken, and there is no way within the private framework to correct memory, no external standard against which to test it. And so the whole enterprise collapses into subjectivity, into whatever seems right is right. And this destroys meaning, makes S meaningless, because there is no distinction between correct and incorrect use. The private language argument has profound implications for philosophy of mind, for theories of consciousness, for the question of whether mental states are purely private or whether they have public dimensions, and if private language is impossible, then purely private mental states are problematic, are not the kind of thing we can talk about or think about in determinate ways. And this suggests that Even our inner lives, even our private experiences are shaped by public language, by shared concepts, by social practices. And there is no purely private realm of experience that exists independent of language and society. One response to the argument defends private language, argues that Wittgenstein's standards for meaning are too strict, that memory can serve as a criterion, even if it is fallible, that we do have private access to our sensations, and that this access, combined with memory, is sufficient to ground meaning. And this response denies that meaning requires public criteria, argues that private ostensive definition is possible, that we can give names to our inner states through acts of attention and association. And while these names might be incorrigible, might admit of no external check, they are still meaningful, still refer determinately to experiences, and the private language argument fails to show otherwise. Another response accepts that individual private language is impossible, but argues that this does not threaten our understanding of consciousness or inner experience, because we do not actually use private language, we use public language to describe our inner states, and words like pain and sensation have public criteria, have behavioural and contextual conditions for application. And so there is no need for private language, no loss if private language is impossible, and the argument's conclusion, rather than being threatening, is liberating, shows that language is essentially social, that meaning is public, and that our inner lives are not sealed off, but are accessible through language and behaviour. A third response questions whether Wittgenstein's argument succeeds, argues that it proves too much, that if private language is impossible, then all language is impossible, because even public language requires individuals to remember meanings, to apply rules based on memory and judgment. And if memory is insufficient for private language, why is it sufficient for public language? And this response suggests that the private language argument creates a general skepticism about meaning that Wittgenstein himself would reject, that the argument needs to be refined to distinguish the legitimate role of memory in public language from the illegitimate role in private language, and making this distinction is difficult. The private language argument also connects to broader issues about rule following, about what it means to follow a rule, to do the same thing repeatedly, to continue a series, and Wittgenstein's point is that rule following is not a matter of inner interpretation, not a matter of grasping a meaning in the mind, but is a matter of practice, of training, of embedding in a community, and rules are constituted by practices rather than by mental states, and following a rule is doing what counts as correct within a practice, not doing what seems correct to an isolated individual. And this social account of rules shapes Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics, of logic, of language, and underlies the private language argument. The person sits with the diary with entries of S scattered through the pages, and the question remains whether S means anything, whether the person is using language or merely making marks. And Wittgenstein's argument says that without public criteria, without shared practices, without the possibility of correction by others, S is meaningless. The diary is not a record but a pretense, and the private language is not language at all. And the argument persists as one of the most challenging and important arguments in philosophy, an argument that has shaped discussions of meaning, of mind, of consciousness, and of the relationship between language and reality. And whether the argument succeeds remains disputed, remains a matter of ongoing philosophical debate, but its influence is undeniable, has changed how philosophers think about private experience, about meaning, about the conditions that make language possible, and the private language argument endures as a permanent challenge to Cartesian conceptions of mind, to the idea of a purely private inner realm, and to theories that ground meaning in individual mental acts rather than in public practices. And the diary sits closed, the S entries unreadable, meaningful, or meaningless depending on whether Wittgenstein is right, and the argument remains powerful and controversial, a landmark in 20th century philosophy. the problem of universals, why redness exists everywhere and nowhere. A philosopher observes that multiple objects share properties. Multiple things are red, multiple objects are round, multiple animals are cats, and this sharing, this commonality, requires explanation, requires understanding what it is for different things to have the same property. And this is the problem of universals, one of the oldest and most fundamental problems in metaphysics. The question of whether properties like redness or roundness or cathood are real entities that exist independently of particular objects, are universals that multiple particulars instantiate, or whether properties are merely names, merely words we use to group similar objects without corresponding to any real shared entity. And the problem divides philosophers into realists who accept that universals exist and nominalists who deny them, and both positions face difficulties. Both must explain how we think and talk about properties, how science discovers laws about kinds, how resemblance works, and neither position has one consensus. And the problem of universals remains one of the deepest questions in ontology, a question about the fundamental furniture of reality, about what kinds of things exist. Imagine two red objects, a red ball and a red shirt, and they share something, they are both red, and the question is what this sharing amounts to, what grounds the similarity. And the realist says both objects instantiate the same universal, the property redness, which exists as a separate entity, an abstract object that is somehow present in both particulars. And the universal redness is one thing that exists in multiple places, is wholly present in each red object. And this explains similarity, explains how multiple things can be red. They all instantiate the same universal, and the nominalist says there is no universal. There are only the particular red objects, and the similarity is primitive, is a brute fact, or is explained by resemblance. The objects resemble each other, or is explained by linguistic convention. We call both red using the same word, and redness is not a real entity, but is a feature of our language or conceptual scheme. The problem can be stated as a dilemma. Either properties are universals, abstract entities that exist independently of particulars, or properties are just features of particulars. And if properties are universals, then we face the problem of how abstract entities relate to concrete particulars, how universals are present in objects, whether they exist in Plato's realm of forms separate from physical reality or exist in objects themselves, as Aristotle thought. And if properties are just features of particulars, then we face the problem of explaining resemblance, explaining what makes multiple objects similar, what grounds classification into kinds, and neither horn is comfortable. Neither provides an obvious easy answer. And the problem of universals forces us to choose between problematic metaphysics or problematic nominalism. Visualize the realist picture, a realm of abstract universals, redness, roundness, cathood, existing eternally and independently, and particular objects participating in these universals, instantiating them, exemplifying them, and an object is red by standing in an instantiation relation to the universal redness. And this relation is mysterious, is not itself explained. How do abstract universals connect to concrete particulars? How does the abstract realm interact with the physical realm? And the realist must either accept this as primitive, as an unexplained connection, or provide a theory of instantiation. And various theories have been proposed, but all face difficulties, all struggle to explain how universals and particulars relate. One version of realism, Platonic realism, says universals exist in a separate realm, a realm of forms, and particulars participate in forms, and the perfect circle exists in the realm of forms, and physical circles approximate it, participate in it imperfectly. And this explains how we can think about perfect circles, even though no physical object is perfectly circular. We grasp the form directly through reason, but the theory faces the problem of how we access the realm of forms, how our minds, which are physical, can connect to abstract entities, and the theory faces the problem of how participation works, how forms relate to particulars. And Aristotle rejected Platonic realism, argued that forms exist in particulars, are immanent in objects, not transcendent, and redness exists in red objects, is a component of them, and this avoids the separate realm, but creates other problems. How can one form be in many places? How can universals be divided among particulars? Nominalism rejects universals entirely, accepts only particulars, and explains similarity without appealing to shared properties. And various nominalist strategies exist. Resemblance nominalism says objects are similar because they resemble each other, and resemblance is primitive, not explained by shared properties. And redness is just the class of objects that resemble paradigm red objects. And this avoids commitment to universals but faces the problem that resemblance seems to presuppose properties, seems to require that objects share something. And if resemblance is primitive, then we have not really eliminated properties but renamed them. And resemblance nominalism faces technical difficulties with explaining degrees of resemblance, with avoiding circularity. Another nominalist approach, predicate nominalism, says properties are just predicates, just words, and redness is the predicate red, and objects are red by satisfying the predicate. And this linguistic nominalism faces the problem of explaining why predicates apply. What makes it true that an object satisfies red? And the answer seems to require properties after all, seems to presuppose that objects have features that make predicates apply, and so predicate nominalism seems to presuppose what it denies, seems to need properties to explain predication. A third nominalist approach, trope theory, accepts that properties exist but denies that they are universals, argues that properties are particulars, are individual instances, and each red object has its own individual redness, its own red trope, and tropes resemble each other. Explains similarity, and universals are eliminated, replaced by classes of resembling tropes, and this approach preserves some realist insights, accepts that properties are real, while avoiding commitment to abstract universals, and trope theory has been developed extensively, has become a major alternative to both traditional realism and nominalism, and provides a middle ground that many find attractive. The problem of universals also affects science, affects understanding what scientific laws are, because laws concern kinds, concern all electrons or all mammals, and laws seem to involve universals, seem to say that all objects instantiating a certain universal behave in certain ways, and if universals do not exist, then what are laws about? Are they merely regularities in particular objects? Are they conventions of our theorizing? And nominalists must explain how science discovers objective laws if kinds are not real, if universals do not exist. And this challenge drives some philosophers toward realism, toward accepting that kinds are real, that universals exist because science seems to require them. The red ball and red shirt share something or do not share anything, are similar by instantiating a universal or by resembling each other. And the problem of universals asks which, asks what properties are, whether they are real entities or linguistic conveniences, whether redness exists in Plato's heaven or in particular red things, or only in our conceptual scheme. And the answers divide philosophers, have divided them for millennia. And the problem remains unsolved, remains central to metaphysics, and redness exists everywhere in all red things. If realism is true, and nowhere if nominalism is true, and the problem persists, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology, a question about whether reality contains abstract repeatable entities, or only concrete unrepeatable particulars, and the universals wait, existing or not existing, and the problem endures. The rubber hand, illusion, when a fake hand becomes yours. A person sits at a table, their real hand hidden from view behind a screen, and a rubber hand, a realistic prosthetic, is placed in front of them where they can see it, and the experimenter uses two paintbrushes, simultaneously stroking the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand in synchrony. The same strokes at the same times on corresponding locations. And after several minutes, something strange happens. The person begins to feel as though the rubber hand is their hand, feels the touch sensations as coming from the rubber hand rather than from the hidden real hand. And when the experimenter threatens the rubber hand, moves a hammer toward it, as if to strike, the person flinches, shows a physiological stress response, reacts as though the rubber hand is in danger. And this is the rubber hand illusion, discovered by Botvinnik and Cohen in 1998. A phenomenon demonstrating that body ownership, the sense that a body part is yours, is not fixed but is flexible, can be manipulated, can be extended to objects that are not part of your body. And the illusion reveals that the sense of body ownership is constructed by the brain through integration of visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information. And when these signals are consistent, when vision shows a hand being touched in the same way, and at the same time as tactile signals indicate your hand is being touched, the brain infers that the seen hand is your hand, updates the body representation, and the rubber hand is incorporated into the body schema. And the rubber hand illusion has profound implications for understanding embodiment, for understanding the sense of self, for prosthetic design, and for recognizing that the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are dynamic and constructed. Imagine the subjective experience. You watch the rubber hand, see the paintbrush stroke it, and simultaneously feel strokes on your real hidden hand. And at first the rubber hand is clearly not yours, is obviously a fake. But as the synchronous stroking continues, something shifts. The rubber hand begins to feel like it could be yours, begins to feel connected, and after several minutes, the feeling is strong. The rubber hand feels like part of your body, and when you're asked to close your eyes and point to where your real hand is, your pointing is shifted toward the rubber hand. You mislocalize your real hand, place it closer to the rubber hand than it actually is, and this proprioceptive drift shows that the body representation has been updated, has incorporated the rubber hand. And the illusion is not just a belief, but is a genuine perceptual shift, a change in how your body feels and where it feels located. The rubber hand illusion demonstrates multisensory integration, shows that the brain combines information from different senses to construct a coherent representation of the body. And when visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals are consistent, they are attributed to the same body part, and the brain updates the body schema accordingly. And the rubber hand, despite being visibly fake, is integrated because the signals are consistent. Vision and touch agree, and the brain prioritizes consistency over implausibility, treats the consistent signals as evidence of body ownership, and the illusion reveals that body ownership is not simply given by innate body knowledge, but is actively maintained through continuous multisensory integration. And the boundaries of the body are flexible, can be extended or contracted depending on sensory evidence. Visualize the body schema as a dynamic map, a neural representation of the body's configuration and boundaries. And this map is constantly updated based on sensory input, is adjusted to reflect current body state. And the rubber hand illusion shows that the map can be manipulated, can be made to include external objects, if the right sensory conditions are met. And this flexibility is adaptive, allows the body schema to incorporate tools and prosthetics, allows extension of the sense of embodiment beyond biological boundaries. And the illusion demonstrates this flexibility, shows that a rubber hand can be treated as real, can be incorporated into the body schema, can evoke proprioceptive shifts and emotional responses. The rubber hand illusion has practical applications for prosthetic design, for helping amputees incorporate artificial limbs, for creating prosthetics that feel like part of the body rather than like external tools, and understanding the conditions that produce the illusion, the need for synchronous multisensory stimulation, informs how prosthetics should provide feedback, how they should integrate visual and tactile signals, and the illusion has been used therapeutically, has been adapted to treat phantom limb pain, to help amputees resolve conflicts between visual evidence of absence and proprioceptive evidence of presence, and the techniques developed from studying the illusion have real clinical value. The illusion also has implications for understanding the self, for recognizing that the sense of body ownership is not a simple direct given but is a constructed representation, is inferred from sensory evidence, and the self, at least the bodily self, is flexible, is not fixed by biological boundaries, and this challenges naive views of the self as a simple unity, as transparently given, and supports views that the self is constructed, is a model built by the brain, and the model can be manipulated, can include or exclude body parts depending on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion shows this manipulation directly, shows that body ownership can be experimentally induced for fake limbs. And this raises questions about personal identity, about what makes a body part yours, about whether ownership is determined by biological connection or by sensory integration, and the illusion suggests the latter. One variant of the rubber hand illusion uses virtual reality, uses computer-generated hands that can be manipulated more precisely than rubber hands, can change appearance, can violate physical constraints, and virtual embodiment studies have shown that people can experience ownership of virtual bodies, can incorporate digital hands into their body schema. And this has applications for VR design, for creating immersive experiences, for understanding how to make virtual avatars feel like real bodies, and the principles discovered through the rubber hand illusion extend to virtual embodiment, show that the same multisensory integration mechanisms apply, and synchronous visuotactile stimulation produces ownership of virtual limbs just as it does for rubber limbs. Another variant explores whether the illusion extends beyond hands, whether legs or whole bodies can be incorporated, and studies have shown that full body illusions are possible, that people can experience ownership of entire mannequin bodies or virtual avatars when appropriate multisensory stimulation is provided. And these full body illusions demonstrate that body ownership is global, applies to the entire body representation, and can be manipulated systematically. And the flexibility of body ownership is even greater than the rubber hand illusion alone suggests, extends to whole body reconfiguration. And this has implications for understanding disorders of body ownership, for understanding phantom limbs and body integrity identity disorder, and for developing therapeutic interventions. The rubber hand sits on the table, fake and obvious, and yet after synchronous stroking, it feels real, feels like part of the body, and the person flinches when it is threatened, responds emotionally and physiologically as though their real hand is in danger. And the illusion reveals that body ownership is constructed, is inferred from multisensory consistency, is flexible and dynamic, and the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are continuously updated based on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion endures as one of the most striking demonstrations in cognitive neuroscience, a phenomenon that challenges assumptions about embodiment, that reveals the constructed nature of the bodily self, and that shows that even the most basic sense, the sense of which body parts are yours, is not simply given but is actively maintained through brain processes that can be fooled, can be manipulated, and the rubber hand becomes real, becomes incorporated, and the illusion persists.